So we finished with the stomach digestion. We figured out the anatomy, right? We figured out the microanatomy, the cells that produce different stuff in the stomach. And then we figured out how acid is produced, how chyme is moved inside of the stomach. One of the last things to talk about is the regulation of stomach activities. And again, this flow chart may be a little overwhelming. But in fact, it's a perfect example how you can make a fairly simple concept, when you put it in the form of a picture, how you can make it awfully complicated. When we talk about digestion, I need to start counting how many times we're going to say that the major stimulus for digestive tract is food. So it's, I don't know, 25th. So you always have to think about what stimulates and what inhibits. And in my opinion, that's fairly simple, because we all can imagine the process of eating. So even before you sit at the dinner table and start to eat, what happens first? You smell it, you see it, you think about it. You can even think about it. Does that make sense? That's going to be your first stimulus. When you see, smell, taste, do you perceive that sensation consciously? Okay, now, if I think of broccoli now, I don't think my digestive system will be very much excited. Okay? So, but for somebody else, it can be completely different. So even things, some things may be appealing, some things may be not. Even thought or sight or smell can stimulate and will stimulate the digestive activities. Again, it happens through the vagus nerve. Essentially, this all works through the hypothalamus and medulla, okay? Because honestly, the regulation of the digestive secretion, digestive motility, okay, peristalsis in the stomach, this regulation is unconscious. You can't control. So even though you can control your thoughts about food, or you may or may not see the food, okay, but the downstream events are not out of your control. So again, you have the stimulus, nervous stimulus, sight, smell, and this stimulus initiates the motor response. It's a reflex. Again, it's a vagal reflex. Okay? Stimulus goes through the hypothalamus. Hypothalamus initiates the motor response through the vagus nerve. Does that make sense? So if I will tell you, you walk in the kitchen, it smells good. Will it stimulate digestive activities? Yes, you don't even have food yet. It will already stimulate your digestive activities. So, hydrochloric acid production will go up. Your stomach will start to talk to you, because of the movements. Okay, you will feel how it moves in there a little, right? It also will stimulate digestive activities in other parts, like salivation. That makes sense? Even before. So this phase of regulation is called cephalic phase, the brain level, right? Now, think about this. What can inhibit activities on the cephalic level? it should go through the hypothalamus. Really, right? It should go through the hypothalamus. Loss of appetite. Does that make sense? It can be physiological loss of appetite when leptin inhibits the centers that control appetite, control hunger. But we're more interested in psychological stimuli. When you're not hungry because you're sad, because you're depressed, okay? When you're just not hungry. When you're not hungry, your stomach will not digest food. So if you will try to stuff yourself when you are not hungry, you're going to have digestive problems, like constipation or bloating or something, because you don't produce enough gastric juice. Does that make sense? It all works through the hypothalamus again. Okay, that was cephalic phase. Next is the gastric. We went over it just before now, went over it in excruciating details. What will stimulate gastric secretion at the level of the stomach? What should happen to the stomach so distension, okay. Distension, okay. Works through two types of reflexes. Local ones, through the myenteric plexus, in the muscular layer of the wall, and so-called vagovagal reflex. Remember we talked about like the vagus nerve? Vagus nerve conveys the sensory input to the medulla. Medulla produces the motor output to the smooth muscles. Okay? That makes sense? Not only smooth muscles, of course, also, all the secretory activities and stuff. Chemicals. Short peptides, 3, 4, 5, I don't know, 7 amino acids, and caffeine will stimulate G cells. Let me go back for a second. G cells will produce gastrin. Gastrin will stimulate ECL cells to produce histamine. Histamine will stimulate parietal cells to produce hydrochloric acid. Does that make sense? So you see, chemicals and mechanical distension both stimulate digestive activity in the stomach. It can be based on so it's a nervous stimulus right here, or it's a totally local effect. It doesn't even involve any nervous activity. It directly stimulates G cells, okay, and gastrin goes into the blood. Now think about this. Since it's a hormone, it goes into the blood, it will have systemic effects. Not only restricted to the stomach. Of course, stomach will be affected, but not only restricted to the stomach. And speaking of which, if you overconsume coffee, might as well get reflux because of increased acidity. Because caffeine stimulates G cells. More gastrin means more hydrochloric acid. But if you stop drinking, then it's fine. But if you keep drinking coffee, you're going to have increased acidity. You're going to get overstimulation of the entire digestive tract through the gastrin. And if you really overconsume coffee, then you should not stay farther than about 10 feet in the restroom. That make sense? What can inhibit? Stress, of course. Because when we talk about stress, we talk about sympathetic activation. When we talk about sympathetic activation, we talk about inhibiting across the board all digestive activity. Peristalsis, secretion, all of it is going to be inhibited. For instance, through the stimulation of somatostatin release, which inhibits digestive activities across the board. I'm going to get to that table. Somatostatin responds, it is a product of final result of sympathetic stimulation of stomach mucosa. another thing that obviously that you figured out for me actually, just recently, that excessive acidity, okay, will inhibit secretion of gastrin from G cells, okay, and therefore decrease the digestive activity of the stomach. Does that make sense? So if you decide to drink like a bunch of hydrochloric acid, it will slow down your stomach. Yes.
So, because coffee is acidic, right?
Yes.
So is it like a fine line then between the whole caffeine thing, or is that like a
It's not that acidic. It's not going to increase acidity in the stomach that much. The caffeine will have much more profound effect on the stimulation part than acidity on the inhibition part. Does that make sense? And if you already, coffee is something like 4 or 5, so if you already have about 3, 2.5 in the stomach, 4 or 5 is not going to make it more acidic. pH that it's lower acidity, it's not going to be that effective. And then you have intestinal phase. I'm not trying to be British and say intestinal. So there are 2 effects on the from the intestinal side. One, remember I told you there's a short, brief effect. Okay? The intestinal gastrin, okay, is released in the blood when chyme is in the duodenum. Now, think about this. When chyme enters duodenum, what happens to the duodenum? It distends, and chemically, there's some stuff going on. What is the most important marker? Because we're gonna go to duodenum soon. What is the most important marker of the food that just left stomach and entered duodenum? Something that can be found in the stomach, but not in the duodenum. Chemical. Hydrochloric acid, right? So when acidic food enters the duodenum, that is immediately sensed by the chemoreceptors. That makes sense? So that chemical stimulation and mechanical distension will, in a very short term, stimulate the activity. So it's, come on, give me chyme. But in the long term, the same stimuli will override this effect through so-called enterogastric reflex. So enterogastric reflex through the vagus nerve, okay, regulates the digestive activity of the stomach based on the food that enters the duodenum. So when food gets in the duodenum, in the longer term perspective, it slows down the stomach. It tells it, wait for a bit, I need to deal with those 3 meals of chyme that you just delivered. Once I'm done, I'm going to accept another 3. Okay? So it goes sort of in waves. If you think about this, if my right hand is the stomach, and the higher it is, the higher the level of activity, and the left hand is the duodenum, when stomach goes high in activity, in digestive activity, it's going to spill over chyme into the duodenum. So now digestive activity in the duodenum will start to go up because it needs to absorb, digest and absorb nutrients in a chyme. It will inhibit the stomach activity. At the height of the digestive activity in the small intestine, when the chyme is gone, small intestine will start to slow down. That will speed up the stomach. So it goes back and forth. Does that make sense? Right? Okay. So that's one. This is a reflex. It is a nervous response. It either involves CNS, like nuclei in the medulla, local enteric plexuses that are located in the submucosa or muscularis externa of the wall of alimentary canal. But it also as endocrine component. Okay? So these three hormones, secretin, cholecystokinin, and vasoactive intestinal peptide. Now, cholecystokinin, often known as CCK, just easier, and vasoactive intestinal peptide is VIP. Okay? That makes sense? So they will either inhibit the secretory activity of the stomach, and vasoactive intestinal peptide will slow down the mechanical activity. Now, we spent a lot of time talking about this scheme, but if you think about the whole thing, it makes perfect sense. Your expectation of food stimulates digestive activity. Food being in there stimulates the digestive activity. Now, with the exception of the short term, I mean, I'm not saying you don't have to know that. You have to know that there's a short-term amplification, stimulation of the stomach. But in the long term, once food goes out of the stomach into the intestine, it slows the stomach down. And when your stomach becomes too active and it produces too much acid, it will also start to slow down because of the negative feedback response, right? Obviously, when you're hungry, when you're stressed, when you're in bad mood, your digestive activities will also be shut down, especially under the stress, because of the sympathetic stimulation. Does that make sense? So now, I will ask you questions on the exam that what I call a critical thinking question, okay? And you have to start thinking, okay, what about food? Where's food now? What does it do? Which part of the digestive system should be stimulated now? How? Okay? Does that make sense? Think about this. Okay? Now, if you look at the right scheme, it's actually quite interesting. It shows you more the crosstalk between the stomach and the duodenum. So think about this. When food, the chyme actually, enters the duodenum, when it goes through here, okay, this is what's going to happen. Food that has a lot of, fatty food, protein-rich food, acidic food, acidic chyme will end up in the duodenum. So, stretch receptors and chemoreceptors, through the nervous system, through the reflexes, okay, will decrease contraction of the muscles surrounding the stomach and decrease the secretory activity. At the same time, the hormones that are collectively called enterogastrones, secretin, CCK, and VIP, will have the same effect. The effect will be more long-lasting. So this is the word, enterogastrones. And if you look at the word, it makes perfect sense. Entero, intestine. Entero belongs to intestine. Enteritis, intestinal inflammation. Enteric, we usually refer to intestine. Sometimes it is used for the entire system, but mostly entero means intestine. Gastro, stomach. Enterogastrones, they establish the communication between the intestine and the stomach. Okay? And obviously, once the contractions in the stomach and secretory activity goes down, the amount of that acidic chyme that enters the duodenum goes down. Stomach doesn't empty anymore. Okay? Chyme is gone, stomach starts to empty, and we have this entire thing again. So it's all about waves. It's not a conveyor belt. Okay? Diseases. I'm not going to talk about cancer, stomach cancer. I mean, it's a cancer. And I'm not a doctor. I'm not a physician. So I cannot talk to you about, like, different treatments and stuff. It's a cancer. Bad, pretty bad. As actually any cancer, the key to successful survival is early diagnostics. So the earlier it is detected, the better. Stomach is not an essential organ. We can live with the big portion of it, without big portion of it. It can be cut out, so it's good. But disease that is pretty common and it's quite fascinating. It's in its origin in it was, let us say, not discovered, but more of the origin of it was discovered is the gastric ulcer. You can see ulcer right here. It's pretty much a wound. The epithelium of the stomach gets destroyed by inflammation, and that exposes underlying tissues, the submucosal layer, to the acid, and it's not protected. It gets destroyed and it goes down and down. In some cases, the ulcer can be penetrating all the way through the stomach wall, and it's actually a life-threatening condition. A classmate of mine died because of the ulcer like that. In 24 hours, he was hospitalized, and 24 hours later, he was dead. It's extremely rapidly developing because you have all the microbes, mostly H. pylori, and a flow of acid going into the abdomen. Okay, and actually, we'll get to one more thing that I completely forgot to talk about. So, ulcer may be caused either by the tumor, that pretty much a tumor of like composed of G cells. They overproduce gastrin. You constantly have a secretion. But another thing, but it's not very frequent, but ulcer is much more frequent that Zollinger-Ellison syndrome. Okay, so two Australian scientists, Marshall and Warren. I think Warren was Robert Marshall, and I don't remember what was Warren's name. One of them was a scientist. I think Marshall was a physician, I think. I wouldn't take my words to the bank, though. They noticed that they could isolate Helicobacter pylori, the gram-negative microbe, you see the vibrios here, from the stomachs of individuals with gastric ulcer. And they found association that H. pylori is way more frequent in people. Pretty much from all samples with gastric ulcer, they isolated H. pylori. And people without gastric ulcer had much less. Occasionally they had H. pylori. So there was clear association, ulcer and H. pylori. But association doesn't mean causation. Okay? So what to do? They first of all, they struggled to grow it. They finally were able to cultivate the bacteria. But then, what to do? So Marshall actually consumed the beaker of the culture, H. pylori. And knowing how generally the bacterial culture smells, I applaud his bravery. Without even talking about consequences, just drinking that crappy I believe it's crappy tasting and foul smelling fluid. Yes. I'm not familiar. I think it's an obligate anaerobe. I'm not sure about obligate, but it was tough, yeah, because they couldn't find what media they should use. They figured it out. It took them several months, and usually, just put it on the plate and it grows. It took them several months, and it was kind of slow grower. So it took them a while to accumulate it in like considerable amounts. And then Marshall drank a beaker of it. Well, guess what? A few days later, he developed, first of all signs and symptoms of gastric ulcer. They did endoscopy. He had gastric ulcer. They did biopsy. It was classic gastric ulcer. It's pretty interesting. Okay, so now, so people who tell you that it's not proven, it's proven. Okay, it was pretty convincing, and we know that treatment with antibiotics when people get rid of H. pylori increases the chances to recover. Kind of makes recovery easier. So yeah, it causes. You know what fascinates me? This microbe doesn't technically live on the surface of the columnar cells. It hides inside. It doesn't like acid, no. It hides inside of those cells, causes inflammation, cells get destroyed, and you get a gastric ulcer. Okay. Now, one of the messages that I want to convey here is this. Gastric ulcer is, if you look at the broader, if you take a broader view at it, it's a chronic inflammation of the epithelium in the stomach, which essentially leads to the destruction of epithelium. One of the hypotheses, sort of general idea, is that not like accepted, but considered in scientific and medical community, is that chronic inflammation anywhere may lead to cancer, right? And there are studies that suggest having gastric ulcer increases the risk for later gastric cancer. So, I mean, it shouldn't be left untreated. That's one. Another thing is non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs. Okay? Do you know, except for aspirin, do you know any others? Huh? Motrin, well, ibuprofen, Tylenol, right? Paracetamol. So these drugs inhibit synthesis of the compounds that are called prostaglandins. Okay, prostaglandins are other important regulators for the production of mucus and bicarbonate ions. So essentially, prostaglandins are involved in multiple biochemical processes. They regulate fever, they regulate pain. That's why if you look, it's fever reducer, pain reliever. It has two effects, okay? And in the stomach, they regulate production of bicarbonate and mucus. When they go down, protection of the intestinal epithelium goes down as well. By the way, another thing, you've heard about aspirin being antithrombotic. It prevents formation of clots. That's sort of, it also is working through regulation of prostaglandin production. One of the prostaglandins, so-called thromboxane A, aspirin inhibits it, and platelets become less sticky. That's it. Okay. So when you use things like Advil or, and I ran out names, Tylenol. Okay, Tylenol is not so hot because of the liver toxicity, but Advil or any other NSAID, they will tell you, take it, but be careful. You may exhibit intestinal syndromes. And it's absolutely true. I mean, when you take it for 5-6 days, you're very likely to end up with acute gastritis. You stop taking them, you fully recover. So it's kind of a side effect of them. That make sense?
So does it not matter? Because like I know, like when I take it, my mom always said, "Oh, don't take it on an empty stomach," type of thing. Would it matter if you had food in your stomach, really, if it inhibits it anyway?
Not really. Not really. No. The only thing is, think about it's a balance of acid versus base. So if you reduce acid production of base and mucus, okay, then acid that is already there will be more aggressive. You're not going to increase the amount of acidic secretions. You're going to lower your defense against them, right? When you take it on the stomach that has food, food kind of neutralizes some of the acid, that's it. But it's more of a long term, okay? And so probably if you take it now and then, I didn't eat for a while, I'm really hungry. If I take Advil now and then go and eat, I don't know, a muffin 30 minutes later, it's probably okay. But if I will start taking Advil and have like a cup of coffee in the morning and that's it for a couple of days, I'm going to suffer. Actually, I'm quite sensitive to the stuff. I really suffer. It was bad. It's really awful, that type of gastritis. Okay. So we figured out the stomach. We're going to start. Oh, one thing that I didn't mention ever. When we crossed the boundary between the esophagus and the stomach, also crossed another boundary. Anatomically. Went through one cavity to another. The thoracic to abdominal, right. Is that cardiac orifice is pretty much in the diaphragm. That's where the esophagus ends and the stomach starts. Okay? It starts right under the diaphragm. But it's already the abdominal organ. Okay? I don't know if evolutionary it was, any evolutionary meaning in separating stomach, which if there's a little rupture will be abdomen, from the heart. Obviously, you don't want the stomach content to spill over the heart, but on the other hand, if it spills over in the abdomen, it's not going to make your life any easier. You're still pretty much screwed if you don't have a doctor. Few words about the duodenum. The word duodenum means 12 fingers. Actually, in Russian, this organ, this part of the digestive system, the name means the part of the colon or the intestine that is 12 fingers long. Of course, not like this, but like this. Should be pretty big fingers. It's about what 10 inches. So probably thumbs. Okay. That makes sense now? Okay. So it's short. 10 inches is short. Really short. And it's the most important digestive organ that you have. Rather narrow, but still most important because it's connected to two secondary digestive organs. The liver, that among many other functions produces bile and releases it through the common bile duct in the duodenum. And pancreas, which produces pancreatic juice and releases it into the duodenum as well. Actually, those ducts, the pancreatic duct, you can see it here, and bile duct, they merge together, and the product that they release in the duodenum is a mixture of bile and pancreatic juice. Yes? Did you catch it out? Feral? Feral? Okay.
Well, the bile ducts, some of the cats, it had exploded, and the intestines were green. It was really cool.
Probably because the overwhelming production of bile exploded.
Like how it ruptured.
Oh,
Not like
green
bile
on the
ducts,
outside or green on the inside?
on the inside.
I don't know why they exploded then. But it's definitely because of a lot of bile being produced. So urobilinogen and bilirubin, that is a component of bile that gives it a green hue. Yeah, it's interesting. Didn't know. I have to think about, maybe they had obstruction, gallbladder obstruction, I don't know. Yeah, that may be. So that place where they deliver is called hepatopancreatic ampulla. So hepatopancreatic ampulla. You see that little thingy? That's it. Okay. Parasympathetically, it's still controlled by the vagus nerve. Okay. Sympathetically, via the splanchnic nerves in the stomach. And superior mesenteric artery delivers the blood to the tissues. Okay? To the tissues of the intestine. But it's not as cool as the veins, the mesenteric veins. They take the blood from the intestine because what they're going to take with them? Nutrients. Where do you think they're going to go? Huh? Where do you think they're going to go? It's actually a portal vein. It goes to the liver. So that's your first stop. You have to control what you take actually from there, because it may not be only nutrients. It can be a lot of crap and pathogens and stuff. That makes sense? I'm going to talk about surface modifications next time. Okay?